Rob here, and in this video we're going to continue to look at the audiences for Assassin's Creed, but we're going to particularly look at fandoms. Now, we don't just need to look at your mainstream math specialist or unspecialist audiences. We have to consider how people are not just passive consumers but can be active consumers. Whilst many consumers of Assassin's Creed, just like any other media text, will be simple, just, and they're playing this game for entertainment, just like with any other game. But there, as we know, are out there fans who can shape their entire identity around their favourite media text, whether it be traditionally Star Trek was the one that sort of like was the original fan culture that we think of today. There is, whatever, it might be Harry Potter or James Bond or Lord of the Rings or whatever it is you're into. I mean, there are people out there who are, translating Shakespeare into Klingon, for example, right? So there are some people who are much more active participants rather than merely passive consumers. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at in this video. Now, there are a couple of theories that we're going to look at linking to this. The first one is Henry Jenkins' theory of fandom. He says that fans can be active participants in the construction and circulation of textual meanings. Now, this does tie in with Stuart Hall's reception theory about how you can have dominant, hegemonic, preferred readings, negotiated readings, and oppositional readings. So you can have, for example, camp readings of media products, like the gay readings of The Wizard of Oz, for example, or people who like films not because they're good, but because they're bad. Okay, so there's that kind of way in which people can create their own meanings for things. But what he's getting at here is more about the idea that fans can construct their entire social and cultural identity around their fandoms. They will borrow and inflect mass culture images as part of participatory culture that has a vital social dimension. You are part of a fan community, and you socialize with people who like the same things you do. You will then often appropriate those texts in ways that were not necessarily intended or indeed authorized by the original producers, and making your own media products. Now, what we're talking about here is geek culture. Geek culture used to be something that was seen as existing within the margins of society, and geeks were looked down upon and bullied and treated badly for their love of whatever it is they loved. Now, and this is largely because of Disney and the Marvel franchise, and of course Harry Potter, I guess, as well, but geek culture has very much become the mainstream. But there are degrees of geek culture, and some people take it a lot more seriously than others. As I said, geek culture has a tendency to be looked down upon, but frankly, I don't see any real difference between the kind of people who like to dress up as Klingons on the weekend and speak to each other in, made-up languages. I don't see any difference in that and the kind of people who are going to paint their face in their team colours and, dress up in replica Messi strips and go and see their favourite football team. They're still tribal behaviours. They're still geeky behaviours. Knowing the names of every single character in the Lord of the Rings is no more or less geeky than knowing the names of the starting lineup of every Sheffield Wednesday team for the last 100 years. They're equally geeky, it's just that one is seen as being a bit more socially mainstream than the others. Alright? So, Let's not look down on these people, okay? Right. There is a social dimension to fandom. That's the key thing here. But there's also a creative element of fandom. This brings us to David Gauntlet. As we said, the theory of identity, the idea that the media provides us with tools or resources we use to construct our identities. There are people out there who are hardcore Hunger Games fans, hardcore Star Wars fans, hardcore, whatever fandom you're into. All right. Interesting. This kind of originally goes back to the late 19th century in Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes had some of the original fandoms. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes character had its own geek culture associated with it. As indeed, actually, did Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was a superstar back in the day. He was sort of like we tend to think of his stories as being quite highbrow nowadays, but they were mainstream geek culture back in the day, in the 19th century. But anyway, as I said, people tend to, shape their entire identity, in some cases, around their favourite media texts, their geek fandoms. All right. So, in the past, we had more singular, straightforward messages about the type of male and female identities that we aspire to. And today there's much more diversity in terms of a range of stars and icons and things we can pick and mix from. Right? So, as I said, we're no longer, this idea that things that used to be considered geeky, to be looked down upon, are now actually celebrated. This brings us to Clay Shirky and his end of audience theory and the influence that the internet and other digital technologies have had on these cultures. Again, the idea that audiences were passive consumers of media concept doesn't exist anymore. Media audiences are far more interactive now. They're less passive, they're more active. We can speak back to the media, but this can be both positive and negative, to the extent that it can be actually very toxic and misogynistic. I mentioned in the last video the entire Gamergate controversy. That's worth looking up, and about toxic masculinity and how female gamers were subjected to horrifying misogynistic abuse. Again, there are some very toxic, especially male fandoms out there, which ties in with a lot of racism as well. As I speak about this, there's the news about they're going to make a TV series of Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics, and there's a big controversy about the fact that one of the traditionally white characters is being cast with a black actress, and there's been a lot of backlash against that. So there was, this kind of thing rears its ugly head on a distressingly regular basis, right? But fan culture can become extremely difficult, to the point that media producers are increasingly taking fan reactions into account, and it's shaping the actual kind of product they're creating. So you're basically pandering to the fans, and this has the side effect of making media products more generic, more boring, and more risk averse and less interesting. So playing to the fans and making stuff purely for the fan audience is kind of ruining media, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, what kind of fan culture can we talk about? Well, video games have been stereotypically seen as a very isolating experience. traditionally they were seen as things that people played on their own. I don't think that's ever been true. You know, back before there were things such as home video games consoles, people would go to arcades to play video games, which, let's face it, is a very social experience. You know, there were games you could play against other people. You know, two-player games, and even more in some cases. Then you've got, you know, like Gauntlet, you know, back in the early 80s, could have 4 players on it, cooperative, fighting together to complete the game. Obviously, as gaming has become more sophisticated, the idea that, you know, you could link games consoles together and play on split screen, for example. I mean, game consoles traditionally would come with 2 controllers, or if you had a Biosec controller. But, you know, you could play against another person or with cooperatively another person. And this has become even more true once we moved into the online environment. So as soon as the internet and broadband made it more feasible, so we're talking since about 2000 when broadband was introduced, video gaming went online, and now it's a massive, massive industry. And most video games are now the AAA franchise kind of games. Think of, the Rainbow Six and other Tom Clancy games that are Ubisoft, one of Ubisoft's major franchises, were traditionally single-player games, but now they're almost entirely gone online multiplayer. So, video games offer a social experience, whether you are part of a clan and you all play together against other clans, you know, or whether you are, you know, on your own fighting against other people. Think of things like Fortnite, for example. Or whether you're just part of some kind of fandom. People can be very, very passionate about their games, but they can also be their harshest critics. So, as we can see here, we've got, you know, your message boards, your sort of like your fan, sort of like meetups, where basically you can go online and discuss your favourite games. Right? So, within that fandom, there's this idea that people are participatory. So not only are you talking about and playing games with other gamers, but people use it as part of their identity. Now, one of the big things we've got nowadays is cosplay. People love to dress up as their favourite characters from whatever fandom they're into. When you factor in things like Comic-Con and these other sort of like fan conventions, cosplay has become a massive big deal. And you can go out and you can buy cosplay costumes, but if you're really seriously into it, you make your own. So cosplay is a big deal, and it's a very, very big industry nowadays. And of course, in the case of Aveline the Grand Prix, you've got a female woman of colour, but what's particularly interesting, she's one that's not especially sexualised. There's a disturbing sexualisation of cosplay, but this character doesn't really fit into that. So cosplay is a big deal. There's also textual poaching, as Henry Jenkins would call it, where people who are part of a fandom will create their own fan art. Now, this might literally be art. So, you know, drawings, paintings, etc. DeviantArt is a major repository for this stuff online. But as you can see, this is all Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation fan art. A classic element of that is what's called shipping, where fans will imagine relationships between characters who aren't necessarily in relationships in the text that they're derived from. So these fans have obviously have shipped the main characters from Assassin's Creed 3 and Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation in these two images here. This goes back to the very early days of fandom. It dates back to Star Trek. Star Trek is the sort of like the classic fan culture, and fan fiction very soon emerged with Star Trek fans, and particularly the idea of slashlit. Slashlit was heavily sexualized, well, let's face it, porn, essentially. Erotica, shall we say. But it usually had a very much gay element. So it was called slash because it would be one character slash another character. So the classic thing would be Mr. Spock, Captain Kirk, gay erotica. That's where it comes from. Now slashlit is a major industry. The internet is full of it. From whatever fandom you care to mention, it is out there. And in the case of this, there are plenty of Assassin's Creed 3 fan sites out there. Don't forget, for example, that 50 Shades of Grey started off as Twilight fan fiction. And when the owners of the Twilight franchise threatened to sue the writer of 50 Shades of Grey, she just rewrote it with different names, and it's now become the biggest selling book in history, pretty much. To put it in perspective, the first 50 Shades of Grey book outsold every Harry Potter book put together. That's how big a deal it was. And it started off as slashlit. So, a perfect example of textual poaching. So as I said, textual poaching, slashlit. This one is one I found here, Winter in the North, which is an Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation fan story, which was published in 2012. It's not very long, it's only 3,326 words long. Some fan fiction runs into the thousands of pages. I'm sure you can go and find your own examples with a quick Google. Just be warned about what you might find. So you might want to pause, write this down as an example. Winter in the North. Again, cosplay. As you said, according to Henry Jenkins, fans construct their social and cultural identity through borrowing and inflicting mass culture images as part of a participatory culture as a vital social dimension. And that's the key points here. A, participatory. You participate in it. You actively engage in it. You join in. And it has a social dimension because you meet up and interact with like-minded people who are into the same stuff you are. And it forms your friendship groups. So, you've got an example there. Again, message boards. Some of these, this one's from the actual Ubisoft website, where people can go and, you know, get help, ask the community, frequently asked questions, stuff like this, so they can help one another. So it's interactive, participatory. This is an official one. It's on the Ubisoft website, but there are tons of them online as well. So Ubisoft forum in this case, that's worth mentioning. They've got their own forums. I will, in this playlist, I will put some links to fan films. Fan films are interesting because some of them are exceptionally sophisticated. They have production values, mise-en-scène and special effects that can rival that of mainstream film and television productions. Some of them are superb, but they're made by fans. Why? Well, they do it for the fun of it, because they're fans. But they can also do it as a calling card. It can get you a job in the industry if it's good enough. But I will leave a link to some of the Assassin's Creed fan films, and I will put some links to some parkour videos as well, because, you know, obviously parkour goes hand in hand with Assassin's Creed. So you can see some of the quality of what's available. I'm not going to put it in this video for copyright reasons. You can go and find your own. But go and find some examples of Assassin's Creed fan fiction. Go and find some examples of Assassin's Creed fan videos and use them as examples. Write down the name of them, maybe the name of the people who made them, and talk about how they relate to, well, say, essentially they're an unofficial kind of transmedia storytelling. Once upon a time, this was heavily cracked down upon by the copyright holders. But increasingly, as long as it's not doing something offensive, like it's pornographic, the content holders rights holders don't tend to crack down on it as much as they used to. So as long as you're not making money out of it, they let you get away with it, because, well, there's no point suing your biggest fans. Alright? So, there you go. That's a bit about participatory fan culture. You can go and find your own examples. Again, this PowerPoint will be available in the OneDrive. There will be more videos in the playlist you can watch, and if you've got any questions, you know where I am. See you in the next one.